Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us for Cherry Beckert's 2022 Government and Public Sector two-day virtual conference. If you're just now tuning in, my name is Christian Philgraff, and I lead Cherry Beckert's Government and Public Sector Group. It's really great to see so many of you that have signed in again for a second day of our conference. And if you're joining us for the first time, welcome. I said yesterday when we opened up how important these events are for Cherry Beckert in giving back to our clients and to those in the public sector. And so many of us have come from the public sector and found conferences like this very useful and helpful to us and our teams. And with the turnout we've had, which has been really fantastic, I hope it seems that you're finding it valuable as well, aside from just the CPs. Get a chance to learn about some new things and hear some best practices, interact with colleagues and some of the thought leaders in the different fields. We have a variety of presentations planned, and as you know, we'll be offering up to 1 hour CPEs per session for a total of 3 hours if you attend all the sessions today. The agenda is comprised of sessions ranging from cybersecurity trends and best practices to mitigate risks, to dashboards and analytics. And we'll be closing out the conference with the North Carolina specific state auditor update. We hope you can join all the remaining sessions we have planned today. So before we get started, here's some items to note. To receive the CPE credit, you must answer at least 3 polling questions and attend for the full 50 minutes. CPE certificates will be issued via email within 10 days. If you have not received yours after 10 days, please email us at cbhlearning@cbh.com, and we'll be sure to get that right out to you. A recorded version of the webinar will also be available in about a week and will be sent via email and posted on our website. If you have any questions during the webinar, please type them into the Q&A window located on the control panel. We'll try to address those as we go through, or while possibly while the poll questions are up, maybe address some of them at that time. Just a note, a short survey will also be posted at the conclusion of the webinar. We really do value your feedback and ask that you take part. That helps us keep these going and make it better again for next year. And with that, I'd like to introduce our first speaker today, Dan Sembler. Dan's an advisory partner in Cherry Beckert's information assurance and cybersecurity domain. He's going to be providing an introduction today on common cybersecurity attacks, vectors, and the best practice to mitigate the risk arising from those attacks. With that, Dan, please take it away.
Thank you, Christian. I am just clicking through to make sure everything is cycling. Yeah, thank you for the introduction. A little bit more just on me, just to give some insight, some background why I'm talking about cybersecurity, why I'm a trusted source in the space. I've been with Cherry Beckert for my entire professional career, so dating back to even an internship in 2008 in our financial services practices, and then transitioning over into our risk accounting and advisory practices in about 2013 or so, and have really been focusing in IT audit and cybersecurity really since that time. I spend the vast majority of my year in service organization control reporting, SOC 1, SOC 2, SOC for cyber. We do a lot in the cybersecurity gap assessment and consulting space as well. More recently, we've seen a lot of traction in the due diligence space around, kicking the tires on a target organization's risk management practices specific to cybersecurity, just to make sure we're not acquiring or getting in bed with an organization who's on fire, right? You just want to make sure we know where the risks are, right? From an industry focus, I primarily focus in technology, professional services, healthcare, life sciences, but there's been a significant uptick in the state and local government space as well, just with all the recent news and focus on cybersecurity hygiene and best practices. As a firm, we offer a lot of different services. We kind of classify in our cyber specific services into 4 different domains, right? In that first green domain, we've got anything that we're going to call cyber advisory. That's, security awareness training. It's technical assessments to include risk and vulnerability, pen testing, ethical hacking. You guys are probably familiar with some of those terms. In the blue, we've got third-party attestation. That's primarily where I focus most of my time, right, as a CPA. But again, the service organization control reporting, we are high trust assessors. So we obviously practice in that space. We do a number of readiness or advisory services to help organizations prepare for an upcoming assessment. And then we're also heavily embedded in the CMMC cybersecurity maturity model certification process that's getting rolled out and will be required from contractors that are working with the DoD as early as next year. In the orange space, I've already mentioned the IT and the cyber due diligence practices that we're doing, seeing a lot of interest in that space. And then a newer service line for us, we're actually standing up a managed service. So some of you guys, or many of you may be familiar with the concept of an MSP, or a managed service provider in the IT space, right? So we can outsource services in our IT perspective, or our IT responsibilities to a third party. We do the same thing, but from a securities perspective. So instead of engaging annually or every couple of years to perform a pen test, how do we roll that pen test into an entire program that can help an organization conduct its ongoing security awareness training and the pen testing that has to go along with it? How do we help remediate and track? Are we doing any type of log aggregation, monitoring, review? We can roll all that up into a single program. That's something we're getting up and running. One of the things I have found helpful in throughout these presentations is to kind of level set at the beginning, right? Just some common cybersecurity terms or recent trends, right? So some definitions to start us off, because I'm likely going to reference these terms throughout the presentation. So just to make sure we're all starting at the same place. When we refer to a threat actor, right, that's a malicious person or an entity that's responsible for a cyber event or incident. They're the bad guy in our scenarios, okay? An attack vector is a method of achieving an unauthorized network access, right? So it's how the organization was compromised, or how the threat actor has gained access to our network or to our data. An attack surface is the total number of attack vectors that an attacker can take to manipulate a network or a system, or even extract data, right? And then an interesting caveat, and this is something that I want to make sure we're clear about in the beginning of our presentations, is we see these terms incidents versus breaches used interchangeably, right? And most of the time we're going to know what everybody's talking about, but from a cybersecurity perspective, they're really two different things, right? A cyber incident is an event that compromises the integrity, confidentiality, or availability of an information asset, right? And those integrity, the confidentiality, the availability, that CIA is what's referred to in cybersecurity as the holy triad, right? You know, those are the three pillars that we're trying to maintain and make sure we're monitoring in our programs. That differs from a breach, right? A cyber breach is an incident that has resulted in the confirmed disclosure of data to unauthorized parties. So a breach is a type of incident, right? An incident is a broader term. A breach is a specific security incident that has resulted in the unauthorized disclosure of data to third parties. Okay, just a quick caveat there. Couple of notes on how attackers or threat actors can exploit attack vectors. There's two main buckets that we're going to classify our stuff into. On the passive side, these are attempts to gain access to a system, a network, to data, but those attempts do typically, they don't affect system resources, right? Examples are going to be phishing, whether it's voice or email, vishing, right? Social engineering techniques where, you know, maybe you're picking up the phone or you're trying to get somebody to disclose confidential information, right? Typo squatting is one that we're seeing some traction in. This is where you have, for example, like a fake web domain, like an email or a web address that is very similar to another organization's. Maybe you're trying to go to wellsfargo.com and somebody else has opened a malicious site that looks very similar to Wells Fargo, but maybe it's missing one of the L's in Wells or something like that. Those are all going to be classified as passive exploits. On the active exploits, these are attempts to alter a system or affect its operation. Right, so these are active, right? Examples are going to include malware, attacking unpatched vulnerabilities, actually sending packets or attempting to gain access to a network, right? Email spoofing or ransomware. Those are all examples of active. Some common attack vectors that I want to make sure we're thinking through, and we're also going to talk through very high level some controls. You'll see some of this reiterated later in the presentation as well, particularly as we're going to talk about incident response and programs and what organizations should be considering as they're building out their incident response program. But just again, high level definitions to level set in the beginning. We probably all know phishing by now. It's a social engineering technique where the target is contacted by someone that's posing to be a legitimate supervisor, colleague, business partner. You're going to control your risk related to phishing through information security training. Think of programs that are required to be performed or to be completed, maybe some testing that's done at the time of hire or periodically thereafter. Annually is the most common. You can also run some phishing campaigns where you're actually sending they are phishing attempts, right? They just don't have a malicious tie to them, right? So an organization can send out these attempts and see what the click rate is, and if the click rate or response rate is high enough, it may make sense for that organization to engage in some more targeted information security training. Vulnerabilities are, a very broad term, but in a very simple sense, they're system or network exploits that can grant inappropriate access or permissions to a threat actor, somebody that's attempting to gain access to our system, right? You're going to control through a robust patch management process. Think of your operating system, your key applications. If you're outsourcing to third parties, are you timely implementing security updates that they're providing back to your organization? You can perform or engage third parties to conduct vulnerability scanning to let you know where there are holes. You can take it a step further and actually perform penetration assessments. What's the attacker see? How can they attempt to gain access to our system? And then provide feedback on how we can harden, right? And then obviously subscriptions to relevant security alerting agencies. US CERT is a really good example here. On the just level setting, kind of the current landscape, right? One of the most common reports that we take a look at every year that comes out, it's free to get, is Verizon's Data Breach Investigations Report, the DBIR. You see that I've got a couple of slides in here related to their 2022 report. Certainly recommend that anybody who is interested or acts in a risk management capacity or oversees any type of IT or cyber practice, take a look at this report. They actually even provide insight into individual industries. So on a couple of slides down from here, you'll see specific observations or trends related to public administration, right? When it comes to the source of security incidences, there really are 4 key paths that protect your network that can attempt to be exploited by the threat actors, right? The most common, and you see accounts for 45–50% of the total security incidences that are occurring during the year, are exploitation or obtaining credentials to gain access to a network, right? How those credentials are obtained can be broad, right? It can be social engineering, could be phishing, could be typo squatting. I mean, there's a number of different ways, but almost half or just over half of the security incidences reported by this breach report for the year are including or as a result of stolen or lost credentials. After that, phishing has its own category. It's obviously so pervasive. We've all heard about that in the news. Just beyond that, you've got the exploitation of could be known or unknown vulnerabilities that we spoke about, right? So unpatched operating systems, inappropriately configured firewalls, things like that. Botnets are the last, and we're just not seeing a ton of activity there yet. Theoretically, it's something we're still going to want to track. You're going to want to make sure you're protecting against, but not a huge pervasive risk that's actually leading to incidents at this time. Ransomware over time, and this isn't surprising. We continue to see a significant uptick in ransomware occurrence and the pervasiveness of ransomware and the role it plays in breaches specifically, right? So Verizon's noting an almost 13% increase just from 2021 to 2022, which is as big of a rise as the last 5 years combined just in ransomware occurrences. So something to make sure you're keeping in mind, and make sure that we really have a focus on that information security awareness training, make sure we're holding people accountable, conducting the phishing campaigns to make sure they're understanding the concepts and they're not ultimately clicking on links that we're not supposed to in emails, right? Always want to call out, the human element in breaches, and this is a pretty constant trend. It's the overwhelming majority of security incidences or breaches contain a human element, right? Somebody clicked on a link they weren't supposed to. Somebody accidentally shared credentials for their account that gains access to a network. Verizon's report for 2022 is reiterating or calculating that 82% of the breaches that occurred that they're tracking in 2022 contain a human element. Could be use of stolen credentials, phishing, misuse, simply an error, accidentally clicking on something you're not supposed to. That all counts, right? And the overwhelming majority of breaches, right, are as a result of a human element. couple more trends for you guys to look at. A lot of this probably isn't surprising, but up at the top, the system intrusion and malicious errors, basic web application attacks is accounting for 81% of our breaches, right? So a significant concentration of our attacks are coming through system intrusion, miscellaneous errors, or basic web application attacks, right? Not surprising that the vast majority of threat actors are external in nature. 78% of the people who are attempting to gain access or successfully gaining access to a system, its network, or its resources are external. Obviously, the remainder is some sort of internal actor, right? Threat actors from a motive perspective, the overwhelming majority, 80%, are still a financial leaning motive. 18% in the espionage range. Maybe there's an uptick there in the public administration space, but we're still seeing very small, very low percentages related to motives for the ideology or grudge perspectives, 1% for each, right? So still financial, far and away the most common motive. So just to reiterate, put a bow around some of this, how do we protect against the most pervasive threats? What are we actually seeing? Security awareness training, you've heard us reference a few times, several times throughout this. You'll see us continue to reference that throughout. Make sure you have proper control management. How are we identifying controls? How are we mapping controls back to the risks that we've identified through our risk assessment processes? How do we know that those controls are properly operating? They're designed appropriately so that we're appropriately relying on those controls to mitigate our risk. And then account management, think of your periodic access reviews, make sure we're locking down higher privileged or administrative accounts to appropriate individuals that only need that level of access for their job responsibilities, and there's appropriate segregation of duties so that a single account that may be compromised can't get too far in the system or have too much of an impact. A couple of interesting patterns over time specific to public administration breaches, right? We continue to see ransomware as a specific threat attack vector that continues to be used, but we do see that social engineering is actually taking a dip down from 2020 to 2021, right? That's the top blue line that you see start to dip down, and it's being replaced by system intrusion. Right, that's the purple triangle that's going up at the end. So a little bit of a reverse. Everything else you're seeing in there, lost and stolen credentials, denial of service, basic web application attack, and then anything else that Verizon's going to classify as miscellaneous, it's all stayed pretty steady. But there's been a flip in that social engineering versus system intrusion. So something to keep in mind in there. And that takes us to our first polling question. According to the Verizon data breach report, the human element is the primary driver in what percentage of breaches? And we'll give that just a couple of minutes. We've got 27% would be low, 51% would be, right around the middle, 62%, a little bit higher, and 82% on the top end. We'll keep going, and this is just a couple slides ago, so I'm not surprised to see the response rates so far overwhelmingly on the correct answer, which is 82%. I think with the polling questions that we have here is always a good time for us to take a break. That's where I'll attempt to check in with some of the Q&As that are coming in. I'll try to answer as many as I can as time permits. So the first one coming in, given limited technical expertise or limited budget, where should a small audit shop spend its time? Given the pervasiveness, and this is where this question is really driving at, given the pervasive nature of the human element that's in security incidents and breaches, you're going to want to focus on security awareness training first and the related phishing campaigns, right? Getting our people knowledgeable about what to look for, where requests are supposed to come from, right? Make sure we're understanding their responsibilities as the end users of the system. That's the best place to start, right? Because the human element is so significant. And this is going to take us to the poll, which is 82% was the answer. And hopefully you guys had a chance to respond there. I did see a 63% response rate there. So overwhelmingly, you guys are correct and picking up the topic, right? 82%, the overwhelming number of incidents or breaches are related or include the human element as the primary driver. Digging in a little bit more to common attack vectors. I did see a question coming in about social engineering attacks as an example. We'll get to a couple of examples here. Again, a little bit of a deeper dive into phishing prevention, that user awareness training. The importance of that is something we really want to drive home. It's providing guidance on the identification and reporting of suspicious activity. Your users are the first line, the front line of defense. So the people who are interacting with the citizens of your organizations, the users of your systems, and have access to all of your confidential or proprietary data. So want to make sure that they're trained up. Make sure you're conducting those phishing testing or campaigns to increase user awareness and reinforcement. You can also, from a technical perspective, implement email filtering to block known or malicious indicators. It could be malicious subject line, or you guys know that libraries are maintained of suspicious IP addresses that are updated continuously. You can use those to block emails so they don't even get to the users to be read, right? You can also implement a domain-based message authentication mechanism. It's going to lower the chances of an email spoof or modified email that comes in to look like it's from a legitimate source, but it's ultimately not. You can also consider disabling macro scripts for Microsoft Office files. This is something that we've seen internally. If we attempt to share documents, Excel, Word, or otherwise that have executables hidden or embedded in the document, Microsoft Office and many of the email providers will let you disable sharing of those types of documents via email, because they could present a risk for inappropriate executables hidden from a threat actor. So that's something you guys can consider. From the malware and antivirus perspective, make sure that your antivirus and your anti-malware software and their signatures are up to date, and that you're managing those capabilities centrally. You want to be able to report and identify instances of suspicious installations or suspicious activity in a centralized location. You also want to make sure that all of the endpoints are checking back in with your central repository, hopefully multiple times a day, to receive updated virus signatures from the provider that you're using. You can also use application directories, their allow listing capabilities, to ensure that only authorized applications or executables can run. Something else you can do from that perspective is restrict or limit the end users or the local administrator capability on end user machines, so that people aren't able to install their own applications. That can obviously open up your attack surface, the number of areas that you can be attacked through if they're downloading or installing third-party software that you're not familiar with. From the more technical space, you could implement an IDS, intrusion detection systems, to detect command and control activity that occurs prior to ransomware deployment. They've got some really robust capabilities that continue to be built out in that space as well. A new emerging area that we're seeing in over the last year or two, started to see a lot of discussion in the public space about it, from the Colonial Pipeline attack that occurred a couple of years ago. And this is the idea of supply chain attacks, or what is the risk that we open our organizations up to when we engage with third parties or managed service providers, and threat prevention from their perspective. So we need to understand that third parties are commonly targeted now to gain access to a target company's environment, right? To combat against this, the world is ever growing. We're going to continue to have an increased reliance on third parties as our systems and our capabilities become more complex and intertwined. So you need to implement formal risk management or cyber hygiene capabilities around the evaluation of your third parties. Right, think of anything you're doing now or could implement now to evaluate your third party's security controls. Think of, SOC 2 reports. That's an area I practice in. ISO certifications, CMMC once it's live, HITRUST, depending on the nature of the service that those vendors or providers provide to your organization, the type of data they have that could drive the requirements that you could have of them. To make sure that they're upholding their end of the bargain with regards to protection of your data or access to your systems. Particularly or specifically, if you're relying on a third party for maintaining your backup solutions, you're going to want to make sure that they're implementing their own best practice recommendations, right? Most significantly, that they're segmenting your backups so that in the event of a ransomware attack, if your production or your live data set is compromised, hopefully those backups are retained in a completely network segmented location so that they're not impacted by that ransomware. That's the most common threat that we're seeing there. And then just from a general threat perspective, right? We want to use multi-factor authentication where possible, particularly for webmail, virtual private networks that are going to allow remote connectivity to our systems or our data, right? Or accounts that are accessing critical systems, even if they're already on our network, right? We want to make sure that we're really controlling those through a multi-factor MFA where possible. Continue to enforce the use of strong passwords and make sure that your users aren't recycling key passwords amongst their key accounts, right? Make sure that the password to access your domain administrators isn't the same to access your email or your emails administrators, right? Make sure that those are separate. As always, you want to make sure that you're applying principles of least privilege to all of your systems and services. This is going to restrict user permissions to install or run software. That's the local administrator capability that we referred to earlier. You want to audit or review those user accounts regularly to make sure that as people have started with the organization or changed roles or left the organization, that the account roles and responsibilities are still properly reflective of who needs those responsibilities. So make sure we're auditing those regularly. Make sure you're enabling or taking advantage of the best practice security settings that are associated with your cloud environments. You know, as organizations continue to grow and digitize and move to the cloud, right? Make sure you're taking advantage of those providers' advanced threat capabilities. The example we have on screen is Microsoft's ATP or advanced threat protection capabilities within their Office 365 licenses. All of the cloud providers will have something and they're continuing to build out those capabilities. So make sure you're aware of what those capabilities are and taking advantage of them as they continue to build. Make sure you're employing logical or physical means of network segmentation. Yes, we mentioned about it for your backups earlier, but it's important even just for your production data sets as well to make sure that the impacts of a breach can be limited just to small areas, subsets of the production environment where possible. More technical, but make sure you're recommending or that you are restricting use of PowerShell to specific users on a case-by-case scenario. For those of you uninitiated or not familiar, PowerShell is a cross-platform command line shell and scripting language. It's commonly used by threat actors to deploy ransomware, so make sure we're restricting the ability to use PowerShell to people who only need that capability, and that we continue to audit the need to use that capability regularly. Typically, those capabilities are restricted only to administrators who are going to manage your network or your operating system. So another layer there. Make sure you're securing your domain controllers. We're seeing threat actors commonly use domain controllers to stage and deploy ransomware attacks because those domain controllers can reach your entire network. So you've got to have an extra layer of protection. Make sure that you're paying a lot of attention to your domain controllers. And then make sure you have a baseline and an ability to analyze your network activity. You need to be able to define what your normal behavior is before you can be able to log, review, and identify and report or alert on what would be considered abnormal, right? So baselining your normal network activity, normal behavior on your systems or with regards to your activity or your data is an important step in being able to alert on potential inappropriate data or inappropriate activity in the future. Something we wanted to include in the presentation here, there are, or there have been within the past 8 or 9 months, new directives placed or pushed out from the Transportation Security Agency relative to incident response and notification of potential incidences to their agencies. Although this may not be directly applicable to organizations on the call, what I do think is important to demonstrate is that there's increased focus at the federal level on the ability to identify, respond to incidences, manage our networks. Security is just becoming an increasing, or it's an ever increasing focus, and we're now even having requirements pushed down from the federal level as well. So these are good good recommendations that all organizations should consider, a very common or a very frankly even low bar to hit. This is something that we should all, or be recommending that all organizations try to have, right? Now, specific reasons for the TSA directives, right, are in direct response to growing cyber threats and prominent attacks that everybody's read about in the news, right? It's the SolarWinds attacks from a couple of years ago, the Microsoft Exchange attack after that, and then the Colonial Pipeline hack that we all saw last year. I want to make sure that we are encouraging organizations to have robust practices so that they can respond to the incidences. And that's what we're going to spend really the second half of this presentation discussing, is how do we build an incident response program? What are the key elements? What needs to be in our policies? Who needs to be included, right? There are 4 directives, and again, I think this is just a good level set, a good baseline for organizations to consider. You know, whether you're in the transportation space or not, right? Number 1, make sure you're designating or identifying a cybersecurity coordinator. It doesn't have to be a full-time position. If you're a small organization, don't have budget that allows for that to be a full-time, an FTE equivalent, right? But make sure that we have somebody that's going to be a coordinator that can respond to incidences, right? Make sure that we're reporting cyber incidences to, they say the Cybersecurity Infrastructure Security Agency, here, CISA, or to any regulatory bodies that are overseeing your operations, right? Within 24 hours, right? The reporting of the potential incident or breach to your regulatory or overseeing or oversight bodies is key, and we'll talk about that again more in the policy portion of the presentation here. Number 3, make sure you're developing and implementing a cyber incident response plan. And number 4, make sure you're completing cybersecurity vulnerability assessments. There's a lot of different flavors, but make sure we're doing something to continue to evaluate the operation of our controls in response to increased risk. So number 1, when it comes to the assignment of a cybersecurity coordinator for the TSA, they had specified that if you're subject to their requirements, it does have to be a U.S. citizen. There has to be availability at all times, all hours, all days, right? Doesn't mean they're working, but it means they're receiving alerts, right? Or maybe you've engaged a third party to help you monitor your network activity and actually pick up the phone and call somebody if there's something pervasive, something high enough risk, right? Make sure you're identifying a coordinator and an alternate. People take PTO, people get sick. Make sure you have more than one person that's going to have the comfort with your programs and your incident response policies to be able to respond and enact those policies, right? Obviously only applicable to those of you in the transportation space. You'll actually submit those contact information over the TSA. If you are not subject to the TSA security directives, just making sure that the coordinator, the alternate, and the entire team's contact information is held in a centralized location so that it can be used and not hunted for when you're actually in a firefight, as they say. We talked about reporting of incidents to the Cybersecurity Infrastructure Security Agency or other key regulatory or oversight bodies that you have a response to. Make sure you're identifying and reporting those incidences as soon as possible, typically within 24 hours, right? It does not mean the incident or the breach is resolved. It can be ongoing, but just to identify to your oversight bodies that we're in an active incident and here's what we're doing to respond is a key element of the plan. Now, jumping ahead a little bit, but if you're in an instance where you have to report on a cyber incident or a breach, the TSA directives have a really good baseline or format for what should be included in that report, right? The first, details about the compromise. How are we breached? Do we know if the number of users that were impacted? How did the breach occur? Which of our assets were compromised? How pervasive is it throughout our network or throughout our data? Do we know if any of our compromised information is used, right? We may not know on day 1 if it was, maybe that changes by day 2. So we have to update these reports daily in the event that we're in we're in an incident, and then remediation actions completed to date, even if we're not done, even if we're still responding to the incident, just to document and provide insight into what we've done so far to protect ourselves and to get our systems online or back up and running if we've been impacted at that level. And then obviously contact information for more information, just to make sure that the reports are continually updating, that we continue to respond and move through. From the development and implementation of a cyber incident response plan, there are 5 objectives that I'm going to specify here. We're going to dig into them the second half of the presentation again. Number 1, you want to make sure you have policies, procedures, controls in place to safeguard your covered or protected information. Make sure you have abilities to identify an attack, right? Make sure we have a way to contain the damage. We talked about network segmentation and some ideas there, right? How are we going to eradicate the root cause? What are the steps we're going to take? What can we do? And then if we're impacted at this level, how do we begin to restore our business operations? How do we get our systems back online so that we can get back up and running, continue to provide our services, have access to our data. Now, again, from the cyber vulnerability assessment, vulnerability assessment is a very broad term anymore, but you're going to want to, as an organization, conduct something that is addressing your cyber risks. It's assessing your current policies. It's comparing your risk assessment and residual risk after you've implemented controls, and comparing that residual risk to your organization's risk tolerance and updating those risk assessments continuously, at least every year, maybe more often if there's been significant change or turnover in the organization, just because the cyber threat landscape is changing always. Make sure that you're incorporating both technical and governance, risk, and compliance type assessments, right? So technical from the attack and pen testing, vulnerability assessments, that range, and then from the controls operation, the GRC space, right? Is there a control framework that we're comfortable trying to implement and trying to achieve? And then make sure that our cyber risk management program addresses our entire organization. That it's that we're covering all of our covered or key or confidential data, that we're not focused just on the highest priority items or where we were last impacted, right? Because we need to protect the entire organization. So polling question number 2 is going to come up. Which of the following is a recommended element of a cyber incident report, right? Details about the compromise, summary of assets that are compromised, remediation actions to date, or all of the above. And while we're waiting for answers to come in there, they're coming in quick, so that's great. A comment from one of the attendees saying just in the last month, they've reported at least 10 suspicious emails, 8 of which have been noted by, looks like a third party, as risk threats. So, again, just anecdotal here, but obviously supporting the Verizon data breach investigations report and our observations throughout the industry that there's an increased focus in ransomware attempts, right? Assuming that some of those suspicious emails are attempting to install or get you to execute a ransomware type attack. Social engineering, still something we need to make sure we're keeping on our radars, that we are controlling, that we are training our people. So that's a really good point for everybody to keep in mind. Okay, so for the results, we got 97% saying all of the above. That is correct. And so we can keep moving on. So again, spending the second half of the presentation, realizing we're about 39 minutes in, so the second half of the presentation may go a little bit quicker. But what are the core objectives? What do we need to make sure is included in an incident response plan, right? These plans can be driven by regulatory or contractual requirements, federal or state laws, right? Could be global or geographic regulatory requirements or expectations. Think of GDPR in Europe or the California Privacy Act over here. We're seeing an increasing number of state entities that are implementing their own privacy or confidentiality or security requirements, similar to what we saw with CCPA, which is California. Also, you could be considering HIPAA, right? If you're in the healthcare space, or touching or have access to covered information. CMMC, we've referenced a number of times. If you're in the publicly traded space, right, PCAOB standards are actually coming out to expand disclosures that are required for security incidences that have impacted an organization, whether they have financial impacts or not. Make sure we're including in our plan our third-party expectations or commitments. Who are we going to be communicating with regards to our customers, our vendors, our partners, right? Who's going to help us respond, and who do we have just a simple obligation to inform that perhaps their data has been impacted, and then individuals as well, right? If we have access to again, covered information for the individual, are there notifications or requirements that we have to those individuals? Make sure we're including that in our plan. Some assumptions and key considerations in the building of our incident response plan. Again, some terms, kind of a glossary, just a level set at the beginning. A first responder is going to be somebody who brings an incident or suspected incident to the attention of others, right? It's not necessarily the person that is remediating the issue. It's the person who first identifies the potential issue, right? Make sure you have key personnel identified. Make sure they've been trained and have access to your organization's incident response plan, so that when we are undergoing a potential incident, we know right where that plan is. We've practiced how to execute on it. Make sure, obviously, contact information is up to date, so that when we're in that firefight, we've got the correct phone number, we've got the correct vendor, whoever we've got to be working with. It's got to be at our fingertips so we can respond quickly. Make sure that we have our required notification documented, and we have timetables documented in our plan too. So if we have 24 hours, in the example from the TSA, right, we had 24 hours to notify their CISA organization or department of a potential incident. Do we have our own timetables? Do we have our own regulatory or oversight bodies that we are required to communicate with? And do we have that documented within our plan? Then what are we doing from a continuous monitoring or improvement perspective to make sure that previous incidences or breaches that we've encountered, whether we've successfully remediated or we're still in process of responding, make sure we're taking all of those lessons learned and building them back into our program. And also baselining, we talked about baselining our common network activity, right? So that we can review, respond, alert. Make sure all of that is built back into our plan, and then make sure we're creating proper communication channels for the cyber incident report to relevant parties. We got to make sure we're covering stakeholders, our contractors, our MSPs or the MSSPs, right? The IT or the security providers, our chief information officers or security officers, our legal and compliance team, or any other key contact, including third parties, could include external stakeholders, right? Make sure we're including all of that in our plan. And then make sure that our incident response plan matures, and it's based on ongoing risk assessment processes. Again, hopefully we're assessing continuously at least every year, and that we're testing that plan so that we've had practice on implementing the plan, and that it's addressing all the risks that we think it needs to address. A couple other definitions for you guys. The incident response point of contact is going to be, think of them like a PM, a project manager. They're going to collect all of the information and start an incident response, right? They're going to manage continuous improvement, lessons learned, make sure that's built back into our programs, and they're actually going to submit an incident report. From the incident response team, that's typically led by an information security officer or somebody that can act in that role if you don't have a delegate or a designate for just that security role. Make sure your team is made up of appropriate subject matter experts. We've got a broad range of potential issues. We've got to make sure that we're covering everybody, right? Make sure that there is a single point of contact for all of our types of instances. Make sure that we're analyzing, communicating, and triaging to all our parties, and then make sure that there's a data acquisition analysis, and management process. And then from the Chief Information Officer's role, make sure that we're requesting supporting information. Make sure we have the document information to investigate a potential incident. Make sure that we're determining the impact of the potential incident on our data or our systems. Are we about to go offline? Do we have disclosure requirements to third parties if data has been breached, right? Make sure we're conducting a damage assessment, and then we need to draft, coordinate, and distribute damage assessment results to the appropriate parties that we have those requirements for. So polling question 3, on the incident response team, which team member is designated as the individual who brings the incident or suspected incident to the attention of others? We have the Chief Information Security Officer, A, B, first responder, C, security manager, or D, managed service provider. And then a couple of questions coming in. Since many state and local governments issue bonds, does this put them in the regulatory space? Would that require them to have extra levels of cyber audit reporting? Very likely, right? Again, going to be hard to speak generally to everybody, but does heighten or highlight the need to evaluate your own organization's requirements. What do we have to report on externally? Make sure we're reporting or including those reporting capabilities or responsibilities back into our incident response programs, so that we're properly evaluating our ability to meet those commitments if we do undergo a potential incident or a breach. And then areas covered in this webinar, are they addressed during agency's annual IT audit? I don't know that I can necessarily speak to that. My hope is that we can distribute a portion or even the presentation in its entirety, understanding we're going very quick through the second half of it here, so that it can be referenced as a bullet point as you're building your own programs. I'll go ahead and share results real quick. The correct answer says fair to share. Okay, well, the correct answer was B, which is the first responder. I will go ahead and keep going through to try to keep us on time. So now let's go through common security incident lifecycle. Right. So now that we have the objectives documented, we know what is supposed to be in our incident response plan. What's a common life cycle for an incident? Right. There's really 5 key stages as we define it. Right. There's preparation, detection and analysis, containment and eradication, recovery, and then post incident activity. And always, right, it's a circular process. So after we undergo an incident, we're going to build our lessons learned back into our preparation. Right. In the preparation phase, we need to identify or designate owners and responsible parties. We talked about the importance of that, right, in the inclusion of our incident response policies, right? Make sure we're identifying our team of experts. We need to provide a communication outlet to report an incident to employees, contractors, third parties, or be able to report suspicious or suspected breach activity. Focus our efforts based on our recent risk assessment results. Where are our risks? Are we properly controlling? Are we comfortable as an organization with the residual risk that exists? How do we ensure that our detection and monitoring controls are properly designed and operating effectively? Think of your firewall, your intrusion prevention systems, anti-malware logging capabilities. Make sure we are building all of that into our programs, and that's all part of the preparation, right? And then provide media training to your organization. If we're going to undergo an incident or a breach, how can we train our people to be prepared to properly disclose and speak to the media, so that we can let others know? Still in the preparation phase, make sure we're identifying a secure repository where we can collect evidence, manage that evidence when we're actually in a fight, so that we have a central place to aggregate everything. Provide company-wide training on breach awareness, responsibility, and reporting protocols that can be built into your broader information security awareness training. We need to evaluate the adequacy of our cybersecurity insurance coverage if you need to engage a new policy. Something you want to be considering at the front end, right? Obviously during the preparation stages, and then some additional steps you can take. Testing of the plan we've referenced throughout here, collection and implementations of lessons learned from previous incidences, make sure we're distributing the plan and that resources are available. From the detection and analysis perspective, we need to create an incident ticket once we believe or suspect that there is an incident taking place. We need to be able to prioritize incidences based on business impact or any other factor that's key to your organization, assuming that you're undergoing multiple incidents at a time, which absolutely can happen. Make sure we're identifying affected resources and potentially affected resources. Make sure that from the incident classification perspective that we've considered the different levels of what's going to impact our organization. Where are we most concerned, right? We should be building that back into our risk assessment processes. Make sure that we are gathering an appropriate team that should be the team that we've already identified in our incident response policies, right? We're getting everybody together to respond to a potential incident or to be able to classify it. Is it an incident, right? Do we need to consult with technical contacts? Do we need to be able to restore operations? Have we been taken offline, right? If we have an insurance carrier, we need to make sure that we are consulting with them. Oftentimes, those policies are going to provide some level of coverage for costs incurred to respond to an incident. So evaluate those policies. This may be the time, or this is the time to get in touch with your carriers if you have a policy in place, to make sure that they can help you proactively respond as well. Make sure you're consulting with your legal teams on disclosure requirements. Set reoccurring meetings, again, multiple times a day in the beginning, maybe daily thereafter, for status updates, next steps, and emerging information as it's coming out. Perform the necessary technical investigations that could include the engagement of third parties from a technical sense to do forensic IT type assessment, right? How do we get breached? How can we respond? Make sure you're conducting interviews with relevant individuals related to the incidences. Can you identify who patient zero was, or how we were impacted, right? And then we need to identify, or this is where we identify and classify our assets affected, so that if we're offline or if we need to segregate certain assets, we're able to do that early. This is also where you're going to identify your indicators of a compromise so that you can continue to evaluate in the future for reoccurrence, right? Document the duration of your incident, the location and scope of the incident, determine the likelihood of misuse or inappropriate disclosure, right? You need to summarize your threat analysis report. There needs to be a report. You typically want to have something that's concluded that you can look at later. Make sure you're retaining and securing evidence, triaging, communicating issues, notifying law enforcement as applicable, building all that into your draft reports. I am going quickly through just to try to make sure I keep you all on time. In the containment and eradicate phase, we need to isolate first the spread of the damage, right? That's our first priority. Contain or make sure we're prioritizing containment where our most critical information assets reside, right? And then we need to make sure we're balancing the appropriate containment with additional service disruption. If we take everything offline, that may happen, right? That can be the nuclear option, but then we can't provide any of our services. Do we need to take that level of action, right? We need eradication where it's appropriate. We need to make sure that we're not removing evidence or other artifacts that are supporting our understanding or reconstruction of the incident. You know, if we shut down a server, are we losing some of the memory, the execution of the event? Would that have an impact on our ability to submit a claim to our carrier? Make sure you're familiar with all of that. Make sure we're identifying and mitigating all identified vulnerabilities that were exploited, right? If there were multiple, did we have service providers? Did we have appropriate network segmentation, patching, firewalls? Are we proactively responding to the identified vulnerabilities to make sure that it can't keep being exploited in the immediate short term? If there's been malicious code, ransomware or otherwise installed on our networks or on our endpoints, are we able to remove it? That's in this phase. And then are we able to remove improperly posted information? Think of your social media accounts if that's been compromised, anything in that realm. Make sure we're documenting key decisions to recover quickly or perform a deep dive with advanced forensics. If we're expecting a potential law enforcement investigation, make sure we have evidence. It'll need to be preserved, right? That's the importance of having that secure repository created during the preparation stage, and make sure we're following our evidence handling protocols. when we're including team members in the containment, eradication, or recovery process, make sure we're including everyone that's supposed to be involved. Make sure that we've followed our strategy. Are we properly responding to and containing the incident? Balancing that with continued service disruption. What's our residual risk? Do we need to reevaluate that? Is there anything that we can implement in the short term, in the immediate term, to respond? Are there additional tools or resources that we need to engage? Is there anything else we can do immediately to respond? Keep in mind the sources of our evidence. What else are we going to do? Make sure we're not implementing any new tools, servers, taking servers offline that may impair our evidence that we're going to need to rely on later on. Make sure we're documenting how our evidence was required or acquired. That's our evidence handling procedures, right? Need to document how long our evidence will be stored, and then how long and where will that evidence be retained. There's probably a data classification or a timeline associated with how long you'll need to keep that evidence. Could be driven by regulatory requirement or even your carriers. In the recovery stage, how do we return our affected systems to an operational ready state? Are we performing testing, confirming functionality? Can we identify the recovery environment? Are we able to consider our recovery efforts, and did we perform them timely, right? Is there anything else we need to do? Are we meeting our any SLAs that we have? Identify recovery efforts with strategic technology objectives, and make sure that we implement additional monitoring, detection, prevention controls. Think of the restoration and ongoing restoration of our systems. Continue to triage, communicate issues to appropriate management, and then educate further on prevention to make sure we don't impact again, right? In our last phase, in the last couple of minutes here, we have our post-incident activity phase, right? So we're going to create and finalize our follow-up report. It needs to document lessons learned so we can build that back into our incident response policies and programs. We need to update that ticket that we opened in the beginning to triage and document all of our procedures, make sure we're reviewing events and timelines and making sure that ticket is accurate. We need to have our team reflect on incident for lessons learned, continuous improvement, building that back into our plans. Make sure we're identifying key control considerations or potential technology requirements that could have prevented this, and should we implement them in the future to try to prevent this, so we don't undergo the same type of attack in the future. Are we updating our threat management engines for alerting a response? If we're aggregating logs, if we're distributing those logs elsewhere, if we're setting up alerts, have we properly updated all of our alerting to more proactively identify us of a potential incident that falls in this category in the future? Are we assessing our resource adequacy? Is there anything else we needed? Did we need to identify more people? Was there other areas of specialization that we needed that would have more proactively helped us respond? And then validation of the incident duration from inception to detection, and containment remediation. Make sure we're documenting all of that and it's properly stated in the ticket so that we can follow up afterwards, right? Last couple of slides here. Review our tools used. Is there anything else from a technical perspective? If that frequency changed, if we had other locations or environments that were impacted, how would that have changed? We need to update our risk assessment documentation, update our business continuity and disaster recovery, review our SLA, service level commitments. Have we had any impact on our SLAs or our compliance with those SLAs? Need to evaluate the adequacy of our cyber insurance coverage. Again, did we have the coverage we need, or do we need to expand or change our coverage? We need to communicate the results to appropriate levels of management. It's again, typically somebody in that chief information officer role or security officer role if you have it, and then further education. So lastly, for our last poll, right at the 58-minute mark, polling question number 4, the restrict and isolate spread of the damage falls into which process or which stage of the security incident lifecycle? Could be containment and eradication, recovery, post-incident activity, or detection and analysis. And then while that is running through, I want to thank everybody for your time. Apologies for having to run through so quickly at the end, but I do want to make sure we keep you guys on time. Hopefully you've found the content informative and helpful. Hoping everybody gets a copy of the presentation, understanding how quickly I had to run through this, particularly for the incident response plan and what else you could include or evaluate for your organization. If you don't have one in place yet, you could use that as a starting point. but really appreciate everyone's attendance. Okay, the last answer I'm going to try to share is it was containment and eradication, right? So that restrict and isolate spread of the damage falls in containment and eradication. Okay. And with that, Christian, I think I'm going to pass it back to you, right?
That's great, Dan. Thank you so much. And
Yeah.
thank you for everybody that attended. Today's session, we had 500 people on the call, and just looking from the poll results, almost everybody was interacting, answering the polls. So hopefully you found it as valuable as we intended it to be. And with that, that concludes our first session today. Thanks again for joining us. If you have additional questions regarding today's topic, please feel free to reach out to Dan at any time. You'll have his contact information in the deck, or you can always go to the CBH Learning at cbh.com, and we can route it directly from there. Again, we really value the feedback you give us and ask that you take part in a really quick survey that's now posted in the meeting chat. Our next webinar is dashboards and analytics. It'll begin in about 15 minutes at 10:40, actually about 10 minutes at 10:40 Eastern. Hope to see you there. Thanks so much. Have a great day.